Hello everyone, today we talk about military compensations in the 13th century treated as a late feudal stage of military organization. The 13th century was in many ways the apex of the same feudal system, but and at the same time its moment of greatest crisis together with universalism. The same term feudalism is somewhat, at least it varies, right? I like to use it because it's fundamentally, like many others in historiography, we know what they mean without having to specify all the time the complexity that lays behind it. The 13th century is a great time of growth, of expansion of the European continent, a moment of also of monetization that passes through this greater wealth that pours into agricultural surplus and intercontinental trade. So a great moment of expansion, especially for Western Europe and its military structures that reflect this monetization, in fact, even in their modes of recruitment and of funding. The feudal system in itself had always been a pretty unwieldy thing. It had never quite worked the way it was supposed to do. The idea was that there was this prepaid fief that I gave you, so that you basically didn't need anything else to levy militias for me, the king, and technically the fief is my property. The political reality was very different. Essentially, once these fiefs were given entrusted by the king to someone, very often indirectly already, Wu settled on them. So this property, as actually this fief proper, right, as property, that's the point, right, and personal property, not public authority, right? And this is very interesting because in different countries this had also different stages of public authority disruption, let's say, and this in fact influenced the same development of feudalism in politics and in the military, also considering what society was in a different distribution of wealth. And we arrive at the 13th century, at the end of the 13th century in this specific video, when it's, the thing is over yet. Like, since a very early stage, that dates literally to, we usually said this thing started in the 12th century, as if there was a feudalism that was reboosted in the 11th on a kind of a functional base. It never happened, right? So what this means is that kings were continuously paying their vassals to come in campaign. It was not always true. There were certain communities, usually the clergy, that were kind of more faithful to the monarchic institution, who participated because it was their interest to side with the king and to have a specific interest in that investment, let's say, but also they had a lot of privileges on their own, private armies and so on, so they were also kind of free in other ways. The point, though, is that this monetization starts becoming also not just a necessity, but a great simplification of the actual recruitment process, right? Because money circulation wasn't something to give for granted before the 13th century. The 13th century is the century in which basically the economy acquires now a very different, starts to see the development of a properly financial system that is going far and wide in terms of expansion at all levels of politics and society. There are huge investments across Europe, usually all related to war, right? Because the commercial activities were somewhat so investments chiefly from small privates that, however, altogether also were able to put in there a lot of money. But this early banking system that develops, especially in the Italian peninsula, and funds most of the monarchies on the continent in Western Europe for their military expeditions, is really an important thing. Also, monarchies, especially in Western Europe again, right, in England, France, and also partly the Iberian monarchies, start to centralize their tax collection system starts to become more efficient, right? Towards the end of the 13th century, the Pope and the Angevins developed especially a very sophisticated bureaucracy for the time, the proper bureaucracy that actually begins, and that the West had never seen since the time of the Roman Empire. Byzantines had something of it, especially ecclesiastical administration. But here the system is becoming really big, very profitable in the sense that the political fragmentation of Europe favored sort of let's say a split of distribution of wealth that was managed by the local owners in a kind of more careful way. Let's say it didn't go wasted into the efforts of a huge empire that would burn lots of energies. So and war, as you know, is endemic. The 13th century is a moment of development, but also wars increase, epidemics increase. So there are great disasters, also great imbalances in the system, structural failures, and towards the end of the 13th century, also this system, the European systems, enters in a stall from an economical point of view. Certain areas even start going in recession. So it's a moment of great structuration of properly management practices. And in war, this is very particularly important. When we talk about the feudal compensation, what it means is that, as we have seen, not just vassals or whoever was basically subjected to a certain power had received in order to manage lawfully those assets, a certain amount of rights, of local rights over the tax collection, things like this, so they could technically have their, as we've said, their resources on their own. But it starts being paid by the sovereigns to field their troops, right? And this is not just a mere question between the ruler and the guy having, this role, the subordinate role. It's also a matter of, we need to have troops fast. That is, normally a kingdom's vassals wouldn't answer all immediately to the call. There would be a lot of political competition even within the kingdom. So this monetization was rendered necessary by simply the fact, okay, I have money, who does want them first, and to get something in exchange though. And in those times where actually gains were still, however, limited, the interest rates were definitely not excessively high. Agriculture surplus was, compared to our times in selling, especially, there were huge profits actually at this point from a financial point of view, but agriculturally speaking, the sheer material produced was lower. Often, in fact, the world system financially went bankrupt at one point, as long as this market could not be sustained after certain structural failures of the agricultural production, because it always started from there. So this was a very efficient way to actually get troops fast, and sometimes the best troops available, right? Because having money was now becoming the prerogative just of very powerful and stable polities, right? It's not a surprise that kingdoms or certain city-states were evolving now at a point that they were really extending their power also more directly on a territorial base, so gaining more resources in this process of savage land grabbing that was affecting a bit. That there is this kind of recompactation of territorial domains that somewhat starts exactly from the 13th century, is more evident, especially in the 14th, and especially in that century, it's evident because those weaker systems that were left out from this structures, or at least that were trying to compete on their own, basically failed, right? And there was a kind of crystallization of those structures that were already well built, and therefore more power concentrated in the hands of fewer people, etc. So there was also sort of institutionalization of such service, right? The idea that a community has fundamentally to pay on a regular base troops because they're necessary for the defense of the community is now normal in many places. This monetization began much earlier than we think. What we see in the 13th century is sometimes for the first time the actual sources of the thing that, however, document a situation that had began from much before, that has started in a much more, let's say, in less systematic, more exceptional way, but still that was also the norm, in largely speaking in the previous centuries. So there was a form of compensation, of refunding that, for example, especially for war horses, like there was 13th century is the acme of feudal warfare, heavy cavalry, shock charges, and literally the feudal technology is as it apex in relative terms over the rest of the competitors. Also infantry is developing, but largely the work is done by cavalry, right? This is probably the century in which cavalry really dominated the most in all warfare in Western Europe. And if you look, for example, at Italy, that had an early phase of statalization, especially in its communes, etc., you find these terms such as the mendum, the restaur, also that is a French Provençal term, reparation. It was Latinized as restaurum or restauratio, for example. Well, this was a form of compensation for those war horses specifically that were killed or wounded and crippled during a military campaign, right? This was extremely important because horses are very resilient beasts. They're very tough, but if they break, I don't know, one of their hooves, that they're done for, right? You can't use them, and this is an enormous loss. Consider that Wu owned the full knight panoply, war horse and spare horses, often with squires and other attendants. Here, it was the equivalent of having a private jet. If you really calculate it, economically speaking, it was an enormous fortune. And that's why also we're talking about the peak of feudalism, because this was the peak, let's say, probably of maybe not of wealth distribution concentrated in fewer hands, in absolute terms, historically speaking, but definitely a moment in which the rest of the population was fairly poor, not be able to afford such an equipment, and there was this kind of greater gap on the field proper between those who fought on horseback and those who fought on foot, generally with less equipment. So if you look, for example, the central Italian city of Perugia, the sums reimbursed went from 15 pounds to 100, right? It was not a few, definitely. And the commune put on this, however, still a sort of tax. There was regularly deducted, that is, the value of the skin of the horse, right? That is kind of symbolic. Also, horses were, when they were done for, they were, like today, sadly enough, butchered, skinned, etc. This was more like a tax that, in this specific context, equaled to 30 solidi, which is also a hell of a price, right? And this allowed also the community. It was a great business in many ways, because think even all the people who actually worked around a war horse, leaving aside the attendants, but also those who prepared the iron shoeing, those who produced all the forage, right, and the equipment of the panoply of the horsemen. They were tiny. There was armor for horses. In the same way, from this century, also something small in metal that we can't clearly see, but we know was there. So it was all the economy, like there were investments from the state for these horses. Very often were also, in fact, paid by the state, right? It was an amount of horses were regularly paid by the state proper. These weren't just a reimbursement for the crippled ones, and therefore usually the state bought within the same city. These artisans that produce all the devices, etc. So war was fueled by this, because you see that there's a pretty warlike situation. A military expedition meant to raid the neighboring district to seize its wealth, its agricultural goods, to cripple the enemy economy, to favor yours. So it was actually, war, as always, is a great business, and a pretty dangerous but also remunerative one when things go well, right? So that's where they got it from. In Florence, in the last decades of the 13th century, the war horses were frequently evaluated by a commission that was presided by the marshal of the city. There was actually a great deal of the administration that was controlling on a regular basis whether actually also the denounces of the knights were true, because many knights, in order to kind of trick the commune, crippled their own horses to get money, right, of the insurance, and there were a lot of scams in that way. So there was a very, very accurate way of also marking the horses, knowing which ones they were, in which conditions they were before the expedition, all this stuff, and therefore there were notaries, people, offices. Once again, a lot of people lived around the stuff, and it shows you how much the war horse in this regard is properly important. And the indemnity in this case was automatic if the loss was signaled within 3 days from the actual occurrence, right? So this was also a time limit to say, okay, if you don't denounce it at the moment, we will not, we will not believe you. That was at least a balance, a compromise for eventually all the problems that occurred in this regard. It's important to stress that the military administration followed the army on campaign, right? So they were not in the city waiting for the return. There were all these administrators in the actual army. We have lots of records from Florence itself. We have actually the only book of the entire Middle Ages that tells us what one army was composed by, right? Because the Siennese seized that when they captured the Florentine train at Montaperti, and we can see how in this document how all the single troopers were called. There was this appeal, why isn't the person there? Maybe because it was ill. I mean, there was all a very, this alludes now from the thing of the compensations, but it was also a way to say, okay, this person wasn't there, why, right? And that thing could be a proof, like we're saying, that if you hadn't gone to campaign, you could have not lost certain things. You had certain things you had to explain to the authorities, etc. There is also very interesting account of the expenses for the first crusade of Saint Louis IX, King of France, right? That very fascinating. At this point, France is basically has gotten its spot under the sun. They have entered properly the Mediterranean, have created a port there, and now they can launch crusades directly on their own from France via sea, and they invest. Actually, these are the Saint Louis campaigns are massive. Like for the time, they're really tens of thousands of people. There's an enormous problem organize all of this with an effective administration. And these accounts indicate the compensation of the value of 264 horses for the sum of 6,789 pounds tournois, the livres tournois. And which means that on average a horse was reimbursed for a bit more than 30 pounds, right? And for the French campaign in Aragon of 1285, the reimbursements paid by Philip III of France mounted up to 34,691 livres tournois. That is more than 1,000 for the horses. That is, by analogy, for more than 1,000 horses. Right? Just think about what this means. Normally, now the full, Miles would have himself more even than than one horse. Of course, normally they had three, at least the heaviest knights, and they were kind of different also in value, like the stallions, this massive, beefy beasts that were pretty slow, but they had a freaking amount of strength. Those were rarely even, those were treasured. They normally mounted rather certain courriers that were also, faster. On the field, they could save your life in that regard for smaller operations, in which the full thickly compact charge was not required. And the other guys normally had run scenes for transportation, especially. But we're talking about great expanses just for horses, right? And also, by the way, consider the logistical expense. As we often said, a horse eats and drinks an astonishing amount of stuff every freaking day. Like, these medieval armies were some of the most radically advanced logistical systems ever happened on this earth if they could sustain such numbers. And there is no doubt about this. Everybody thinks that logistics is just, modern times, the Romans. No, if you look at medieval armies, they went exactly the same speeds. For example, Roman ones, they had even larger logistical needs. It was utterly impressive, and all with a state that wasn't as structured as the Roman one. So whoever managed this were freaking artists and masters in this craft. That, anyhow, as we've said before, needs ever more the participation of a state in order to make it function, right? Only France could afford something like this, right? Some of the largest Italian cities, the Kingdom of England, the Iberian monarchies that had a freaking lot of money. Because, the problem wasn't much the sheer, the logistical problems are actually solved throughout all the time in history in the same identical way. The real problem here is, where do you find the freaking money? It is, where's the motivation for people to come and do that, and starting also to make a living as professional administrators in this regard, logists and suppliers? Well, it is that there were enough resources, like there is an opulence in Europe for medieval standards at this time. The problem is, where do you freaking get the money, right? And that's mostly about the availability of money. And if you have money, you can do everything, right? It's not that you don't have problems, because still these problems are massive and overwhelming for any single power, for which every army is about to melt away at every single step, right? Because of the risks, all the things, epidemics, right? What you can imagine in this regard. But if you have the money, people are gonna stick with you, right? Also, a reason why these guys brought actually an enormous train of administrators also dealt with the management of money. Like, these kings that traveled with literally the court, all the treasure, right? It was an enormous deal, right? These were massive investments. If you get how much money they had with them, it makes you realize how committed these armies were into these sovereigns were to their military objectives in this regard. Because really, such expeditions could make the difference, even for a generation, of what the kingdom was able to field next time. It was a big problem. Now, who owed the service in all this to the king could be summoned for a minimal number of days, right? That is to say that conventionally, feudalism had, crystallized certain customs, like saying, if back in the day, I don't know, the Henry II had given me a diploma in which was written that I had to serve him in 40 days, that I had to be in 40 days and not before. I stuck to that, and if you don't want to, alter that, you have to emanate another edict, and it must be accepted and recognized. It's an enormous deal, because you can't contradict, especially the higher superior, the higher authority, right? The superior authority. And there were all these customs that effectively reflected the political negotiation that occurred every single time. an army had to be assembled, right? It was all political, and as we know, no power at this point had a full direct territorial control in its lands, right? They normally summon just a few of them that, for as we were saying before, for some individual reason had more motives to stick to the king, right? That's why money is important in this context, because what increases dramatically in the 13th century is the amount of volunteers, right? There were always, in all this unbalanced system, always this scum of society that was ready to do everything, right? All these cadet knights that didn't know what to do but to roam around, and if they had no better option, they would enlist into the king's army, and as always, if you had money, you didn't even have to search for these people; they would be immediately there. Like, you have to imagine it in this way. There was no, there was negotiation, contractation, let's say, but this happened locally, right? There were always, wherever the king went, there was always someone around that was asking for something, for a favor, for being hired, for becoming, and these were opportunity for lots of people that also could have a living, if not as knights or other soldiers, even as administrators, logists, as we've seen, military engineers, right? And that's why also the importance of cities is rising so dramatically, because sometimes one of the most skilled, educated personnel is to be found there, right? Knights can do war pretty well on their own. They know how to organize themselves, but great amount of the carpenters, manual laborers, skilled labor is to be found usually in the cities, right? And these centers are normally, we can't say anti-feudal, but generally speaking, they develop this sense of saying, okay, we prefer maybe the king than the local noble, because that was also what the kings often played. We have this idea that kings favored normally and reinforced the nobility. Actually, it was the other way around. Some of the most popular policies were actually enacted by kings, because kings needed to counterbalance the big chunk of aristocrats in the middle that could become too powerful. Very often kings could ally with peasants, for example, to get, or with burghers, like in this case. It was not always the case. Naturally, there was plenty of high nobility was fully referential to the king, as we've seen. But that's also strategy, and it also depends which kind of assets are you in search for. We know of different forms of payment that sometimes were enacted at the same time, right? Generally speaking, the volunteers were to stay for a longer time than vassals, right? For at least given the usual customs, which is not entirely true. There were vassals that would also follow on a regular basis the king if that was convenient for them. But what you start seeing here is that there are kind of daily pays that are accompanied to monthly salaries as well. That in the 13th century is very clear. Again, in Florence, for example, in the campaign of 1260, the one Montaperti we remember before, the signory negotiated, actually, among others, with a Milanese lord known as Peter from Bazzaccape, who was engaged himself and his 50 men with a pay of 8 pounds of small florins per month for each knight, right? And the same city also decided to recruit in Modena 100 men at arms, or actually in the sources Berrieri, that the Berrieri is a sort of is a mercenary, usually identified stereotypically as the kind of a lighter horseman, but actually, especially in the 3rd century, they were getting kind of heavier. and almost undistinguishable from other knights. And it's not even clear what the distinction was, but anyhow. And among these Beruari there were 2 standard bearers and 4 captains, all 6 with 3 horses per each, and just 1 horse for the regular soldiers, right? This is important. This engagement had to last. This contract had to last for 3 months, which also was the normal length of a long campaign. Actually, campaigns lasted, especially it depends where, right? Also, the strategical dimension here, there's a lot of importance. Normally, here Italian city-states didn't have to make very long marches to reach the enemy districts. There are a few tens of kilometers, but think about, I mean, like we've seen before, like French army having to invade Aragon. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. It's a much more laborious thing. It's amazing, and usually 3 months in this regard shows you what I think I can even spot in some sources is that I kept you for 3 months because maybe an expedition lasted 30 months, but you never know what happened in the season, right? If you look at the political military events happening around this time, it was a continuous, you can't really foresee it, right? In 3 months a lot of things can happen, and even at that point maybe the contract could be renewed. But generally speaking, 3 months is, however, the time of the season, right? The time of good season that in Northern Europe lasted less. Naturally, in Southern Europe it lasted longer, but generally speaking, it was late spring, summer, right? That's pretty much it. Something similar was done by Charles of Anjou, right? When he recruited certain fighters with the following monthly pace: 4 ounces of gold for the knights, 2 for the squires and the crossbowmen on horseback, 18 tari, in that basically 1 ounce would be 30 tari, for the foot crossbowmen, right? And here you can see how different the proportion is. And it's not actually even so distant. Like a knight is paid not even 10 times as much as a foot crossbowman. That in this case here we don't have other infantry, but it tells you how the crossbow was actually quoted. I mean, it was important at the time, increasing really as a kind of standard weapon next to the especially the heavy knights. There is this tendency to increase not much number of infantry, regular infantry, but just of heavy cavalry and foot crossbowmen. And here we have also the interesting new of crossbowmen on mounted crossbowmen. And something else I wanted to say, relative to the aforementioned example of Florence, what I record actually is that for most of this time, and also part of the early 14th century at least, when eventually things will evolve into more complex administrative organic units like the Barbuta and the Lanxes that had multiple horsemen per each. Actually, when you read these numbers, especially in the chronicles, but even in the same contracts like these, you see that there is not much of a distinction between, knights and the typology of knights, right? When you say 100 knights, you don't have to think one of these sources that there were 100 knights and then the attendants, right? It could be so technically, and probably there were many attendants, or at least they were provided by the local communities, whoever was organizing the army at the time. But the point is that still these troops are hired separately, and that there is very often no mention, no realization that these guys had retainers, for example. And it sounds very much like these were self-sufficient units that were regularly integrated in larger military systems that already provided for their logistical needs. That is to say, as we were saying before, that with development of the local, let's say, administrations, it was possible to hire these people who didn't need much but to fight, and eventually all the supplies and stuff were provided by the state. This is normal because I mean, even the theory, like the feudal auxilium also traditionally entailed not just that you had to serve individually with your gear and all this stuff. You also had to bring food for yourself for like 2 months. Like this was asked even to peasants. I mean, can you imagine, honestly, at any time of Charlemagne, actual peasants bringing 2 months of food together with them? I mean, it's impossible. Of course, these armies were all organized chiefly by the command, right? And there were logistical systems that relied on local resources all the time, right? And very often, however, that equivalent was transmuted in a tax, or at least in in a certain amount of wealth that had to be paid, rather than, and especially this time, in money rather than in actual food. So that with money you could buy food, but you could do it all at once. I mean, the utility of money in itself is not just like a simple value, compensation. Money has an intrinsic logistic advantage. I mean, it's much easier to transport than the actual goods, and therefore it brutally simplifies the logistical needs in this regard. You can easily bring together with them and buy stuff where you need it, right? So that's why the thing was becoming also much more dynamic in its organization, and all these military expeditions were often even let's say contracted locally. Just think about the same Louis IX that had to go for Egypt, to crusade in Egypt before his death, and he asked his brother Charles of Anjou to give Sicily as a logistical base, and instead Charles refused, and Louis went to Tunis. That's also when the epidemics broke out, and he died with his son, with a lot of people, and the whole thing vanished. And that was actually a chance of conquering Egypt and retaking Jerusalem. By that point was lost, but it was a massive expedition. Eventually also the Spanish brought a lot of stuff there, the English as well. That's when Edward I actually went to his own crusade in the Near East, was almost killed by the assassins, poison. But just for saying how a lot of people, like we're talking about armies from all over Europe that were channeled in a single expedition with freaking tens of thousands of people. All by sea, because there's no other way. Like after by the time of the Third Crusade, it was ridiculous to think to go to the Holy Land on foot. Like it was ridiculous. Just in the First, Second Crusade, you could do that. Now everything by sea, which is much faster, cheaper, and even actually less dangerous than going on foot. You find the Bulgarians along the way. It's something you don't want to fight, right? Because those are wars to cope with than the Saracens. And the point is this whole system is reaching a full maturity on a European scale, right? European warfare that was already dramatically homogeneous in many ways, especially through this broader Frankish legacy that is spread all over Western Europe, even beyond the Carolingian boundaries, was now making war kind of a much more intertwined business at an international level. I mean, the capitals invested in this stuff were astonishingly high, right? And very often it was a lot of very often the monarchies didn't spend much more than they could repay in money. That is what they subcontracted eventually other stuff like mines or other certain productions, right? Because they didn't have regularly still this base the money to pay for this. And we'll see now, especially who was on the lead at that point, which is especially the Kingdom of England, as we're remembering also on in the other video made the other day. about the late medieval state, Edward III, but also his grandfather, as we will see now. There was also another important military service. It was owed for the guard duties, town watches, castle watches, right? At this point, consider that especially the greater monarchies are investing in ever larger castles placed in a fully strategic location. That are, think about that was already old, but I mean, there is a lot of, as we were saying, of proper territorialization in these domains that is taking shape. And also a greater difficulty to stop armies, because armies are becoming larger, more effective, more professional. The trebuchets now are basically all over the place. Therefore, the older architectures need improvement. So there is an enormous expanse, and it's no surprise that why we have the best castles of the time in places like England and France, because they were the most centralized monarchies, right? The others may have a lot of money, but they didn't need to invest so much in castles, in structures like those, to govern. They had other means, right? So in the guarding duties were particularly expensive because they had to last a long time, right? They were not just like during a campaign you make this enormous effort at that given moment, but then everybody is disbanded. Usually, then someone maybe is already not, right? There's always a partial continuity in this regard, not of the full army. That will start happening towards the 50s of the 14th century in France, with a kind of a permanent army that remains after the campaign hired. But still, the employments now at the end of the 13th century are becoming longer and costly. Right, only for guarding the city gates of some of the larger cities of Europe at this time, you have to spend a lot of money, right? Maintaining the walls and keeping them guarded, etc. Sometimes was the thing was included in the normal military service owed the citizenry as a town watch, and that was normally excluded further military expeditions, especially this usually in the smaller cities, also because they were good for less in that regard as militias. But just to make an example, in 1280, when, in order to defend the peninsular part of the Kingdom of Sicily, the same Charles of Anjou sent garrisons in 78 castles, right? Think you're managing 78 castles that were split in among all the main 5 territorial districts of the kingdom. There were the Abruzzi, the Principato and Terra di Lavoro, Calabria, the Crati Valley, and the Jordan land, the land of Bari, the land of Otranto, the Catapenate, and Basilicata. Right. So this is pretty much the whole peninsular territory of the Sicilian kingdom, and the command of these troops was entrusted to 18 knights and 60 squires that were originally of France, as the Angevins generally were. So this is also important because they weren't entrusting it to the locals, and even more because of these Frenchmen, only 16 were actually owners of the lands of the Sicilian kingdom. So there were people who were literally called from France, from Provence, that were inserted in this system. And these castellans also disposed of 1037 sergeants and 15 chaplains that at this point instead were largely recruited perhaps among the locals. And they were hired for 4 months, and they had to receive for the year 1280 something like 8,852 golden ounces. That is, considering 5 florins per ounce, something like 42,260 florins, right? And these cost, if you have an idea of an equivalent, is the cost of a city. Like you could buy an entire city like with 100,000 florins at this time. And all this money was, provided by the Angevin treasury, right? So we're talking about a huge sum. The Kingdom of Sicily, together with Provence, was fairly big, right, and rich. But it's still an astonishing amount of sum, right? And in fact, the Angevins tried to pay this money with a lower value currency and equivalents. That is not with florins of gold, but principally in carlini and other silver money, right? And in reality, the garrison services could be prolonged even for an undefined time. For example, as early as 1247, a Norman knight declared that by order of the king, to have been for 4 years guarding the castle of Leon in the diocese of Dole, with theoretically a daily pay of 6 solidi of Paris. And this Norman knight was actually complaining with the commissaries of Louis IX for not having received from the French kingdom, not even, basically nothing of all of this. But they had stayed there anyway, and this makes you realize too, in general, how there were also evidently other reasons for this person to stay there, right? It was maybe not just the fear of the sovereign, but it's also the fact that, however, still in this period, if you look in Germany, for example, at the same time, there were so-called ministeriales, right? They were pretty, basically they were entrenched in their castles. At this time, they actually were becoming pretty powerful on their own, sometimes even richer than the actual nobility. You know that the German knights, especially in the south, by 90%, they were non-freemen at this point. They were basically serfs. By the 14th century, this juridical condition basically disappears because there was practically no difference in status. But originally speaking, these guys were left basically to garrison this, sometimes even not even castles, but towers, right, scattered in this still almost wild Germany. Just to where they would live proper, right? They would have a living on their own. So this guy, presumably, here in Normandy, was left just with care of the castles that could evidently provide him with some money, some resources on its own. So that's why he stayed there, because otherwise, where do you get the money for years? Maybe he invested some of his patrimony, but there must have been something still that of the feudal system that actually worked, like that he was maintained by the actual land there. At this time, there is also the spread of certain royal officials, that act directly on behalf of the king, that are now scattered on the territory, that are signing basically the local ordinary administration, local communities administration, that were used to effectively recruit people, right? And this could happen sometimes through individual letters that were sent to the most important characters, or certain public bans that were proclaimed by the specialized personnel. And we're talking about characters like bailiffs, sheriffs, the prévôt, the other kind of also lawyers, people that were actually in the juridical field, and also other local administration. That is, these people were actually recruiting the troops for the king, right? For example, it's very famous. In June 1282, Edward I of England basically kidnapped, like in all the shires of England, certain workers such as carpenters, pickaxers, construction workers, woodcutters, right, for the construction sites of the 10 new fortresses that were to be built in Wales, right? This most beautiful castles that can still be seen in Wales and were built at the time of Edward I to consolidate English rule in the region. And we're talking about a sum of 3,000 men, right? So imagine like sheriffs literally taking these people away from their communities forcibly, right? And that's the king order. So the king's order. So there's not much you can do about it, right? And the English state already at this point is pretty heavy, right? And it's very fascinating because all the thing of the longbowmen, for example, that people say, oh, how longbowmen spread, it had literally nothing to do with a technological improvement of any sort, right? Longbowmen existed since prehistory, and also it has nothing to do with Wales. Like, yeah, there were Welsh longbowmen, but we have no record whatsoever by any stretch of the imagination that Welsh longbowmen were better than the English ones that were already pretty famous in the woods of especially northern England, and that even paid more and better saying Welsh. So it's pretty important to say. So that's a myth that's been surpassed basically by all historiography, but it's simply due to the fact that since bows are dimensioned on the basis of who uses them, that sheriffs in the English shires would recruit at their discretion on behalf of the king the best men, that is, the men who were also physically more fit for the task, that is, big, tall, tough people, and especially these wood communities would provide guys who knew how to use their bow. It was pretty large because they were large, because they were chosen among the strongest of the community for that very reason. Hence, lots of longbowmen. That is, there is nothing like a longbow. That's a regular longbow. It's always been built literally since prehistory in Western Europe. It's just that the guy who uses it is larger, and therefore the bow is larger. Hence, the term longbow is a kind of a modern invention. It didn't exist as such in the Middle Ages, right? They were just longer bows because guess what? There were taller people who used them. And this was very important because it makes you understand how already the English state was well ordered, how its logistical system was, its military administration was already somewhat permanent. There was a political consensus to do this with the nobility, with the lower nobility aristocracy as well, and therefore this recruitment could be more direct. This was more difficult in other regions. Like the French, for example, had a more powerful military at this point, but they had more difficulty to actually gather it, especially in these larger principalities that tended to do a bit on their own, and there had to be a much greater political negotiation. But the interesting thing about the 1282 recruitment by Edward I is that maybe it would have even been possible to limitate the recruitment by simply calling up the volunteers, but the king judged this system to be safer, right? Using the habitual administrative mechanisms, right? That is, taxing every shire for a certain amount at the end of, with the aim of obtaining rapidly and also at a relatively cheap price the troops that he needed. And furthermore, also this had an impact on the English market in itself. So consider that since this was a mandatory service, the amount of money was first of all the result of the decision of the authority, and not of a sort of negotiation between the workers and the employers, right? In function of demand and offer, right? So the English king could simply decide who to hire, right? The commission of array, that this is how the English army was recruited, it was in this sense costly because normally it was actually a professional army. So these people were maintain also for a longer time, it required more money to levy. But the way they were hired was actually much more reliable. Also, the other communities of the kingdom at this point had to cope with this, because there were people who back in the day had made a living, let's say, by serving as volunteers that had also some kind of power on their own. Now instead they realized that those people who were hired and that were called for muster for the army and paid for it were basically competitors with them, right? And therefore their requests were limited as well. And this, on a political level, was very important because the king increased further its own power. Naturally needed the money in order to do this, but the English kingdom worked pretty well in this regard, and that's why also this was available in the first place. I mean, had the other powers in Europe had the same kind of political and institutional profile, they would have done the same thing pretty gladly. The point, it wasn't the case, right? And this is the secret of, like, professionalization is actually something that goes on all over Europe in this time, without doubt. Like everywhere, the normal bonds, like the normal services now were basically decaying. Okay, it was just about who paid what, whom, right? That's pretty much it. And feudalism is dying in this regard as a contractual form. It's not dying actually, as we will see now, from actually a political and social point of view. That is to say that paradoxically there are certain the nobility is actually rising also in power in certain ways. Because even if the king hired these people, still the money that were invested were given to someone who had basically provided for their equipment, right? As we were saying before, these guys didn't leave just with their own stuff, right? They were actually provided with them, and this most of the times fell on the communities, right? The king put something in the system, but generally speaking, the clans, the feudal, and even let's say regional, provincial communities, and read in this the aristocracies who ruled them in this regard, paid for the equipment of these people, right? And this is very important because it is what effectively made them true professionals, because they had finally the equipment, the armament that they needed. They weren't just a peasant militia, right? There were people who now were framed within an actual army that had the means to sustain them and to keep them and to start even experimenting something more, tactically refined. It's not a surprise now that there is such an increase, for example, of the importance of the longbowman, that there is a kind of almost doctrinal view of how armies should fight, where it's not so contingental like in other armies of Europe, when the commanders were just coming from so many different communities, they didn't know each other, and therefore they quarreled and they fought in a certain particular way. Now there was a king who decided how his own, we can't call it national army worked, right? And dictating the tactics and so on. That this is not enough to make modernity, to make a state proper as we mean it in modern terms. But if you look at what would happen with Edward III, that's basically it, that you realize that its military reforms went in parallel with the civil development of his kingdom, because they were one in the function of the other, in his view, right? And this degree of control that led even to the development, combined armed tactics of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen, is a direct consequence of this as well, right? And let's see, what we can say is that however, as we were saying, there were this kind of men of reference, this usually the nobility, that provided these troops under their control, right? This was a very efficient way of going past the usual feudal relations and compensating I say a bit for the expenses, a bit from the side of the crown, a bit from the side still of the same communities, and also attracting these magnates, there's aristocrats, into the higher spheres of the kingdom. Think about the House of Lords, etc., that also tied these people politically and strategically to the king in war, right? So it was a very clever system. So what is important to stress in this regard is that these same aristocrats participated to the army. So when we can say that the traditional feudal auxilium, right, that is the actual contribution that you should provide, militarily speaking, by compensating the beneficium, right, is dead, but from a political and social point of view, the feudal class, let's say the nobility as such, the aristocracy, at this point is still stronger than ever, right? And especially in France and in England, towards the end of this period, let's say the 1300, it's always the same classes that are imbued, always the same ethics and mentality that provide the bulk, for example, of heavy cavalry, right? Even if the modalities of the service and the juridical basis and the moral duties to which they're bound have modified massively under this point of view. What does this all mean? Well, it means that basically the professionalization here is investing the same feudal nobility that now is that was already like that since the centuries, right? But now is entering into a more centralized system, right, in which basically the nobility of the kingdom, especially in these larger monarchies, is becoming part not just of a random group of vassals that all live all in their own fief and they have to be paid by the king or, attracted with money to participate to the army, but they're part of the kingdom proper from a political and institutional point of view. These are the people who count, that matter in the parliaments, that have their own say on the policies of the kingdom, and that paradoxically increase actually the control on the populations, right? The fact that England, for example, is using professional troops even among the peasantry, right, is equipping them decently, is framing under the army, doesn't mean at all at this point that, for example, the English peasantry is stronger from a military point of view. This is true because in the Kingdom of England is actually crushing that class under the control of the monarchy. If you look at the Flanders or Switzerland, you see, for example, these are fundamentally peripheral areas of the empire, kind of border regions, also with other lands, and the local communities basically break free from feudal rule and they create something on their own, right? Always given that, there was always some feudatory that sided with them and also trained them, taught them. Look at the Flemish armies. We made a video last week. There were some instructors, some advisors in this regard, taught these people who had basically no discipline, no professionalism of sort, how to stand there, right, just with their motivation to resist to heavy cavalry charges and winning. But as we were explaining on that video on the Flemish armies, this didn't bring them anywhere, right? Switzerland took the mid-15th century before they developed the system, was fundamentally politically active in Europe, and that eventually also was, however, crushed by the larger, monarchies in the Renaissance. Flanders, they won this great, one of the greatest victories of the Middle Ages at Courtrai, but if you look at their military history in the 14th, 15th century, they collected an astonishing amount of defeats. That is incredible. And why? Because they were not framed under a unitary rule, right? England kicks ass throughout all the 100 Years' War on the battlefield because has this monarchic direction, right? In fact, England in this regard is the exception in the tactical progress of the 14th century infantries, right? If you look even at countries like Italy, that actually had a very early professionalization of their military, and they had a very sophisticated tactical development of their armies that combined everything: cavalry, infantry, missile troops, in a very effective way. They were still not monarchies. They also had demographic problems in that regard because they were all fragmented, right? Even Switzerland, when all the cantons stuck together, had millions of people that they could make work to field those thousands of pikemen that by the mid 15th century that were needed to train, that were trained enough with enough resources to be effective with pikes in the first place, and that's the key, the rule, right? Eventually England will, as you know, will first of all lose the 100 Years' War and will somewhat lag behind up to the 17th century continental military developments. But at this time, not only achieves this, but even after the disastrous loss of the 100 Years' War, the enormous crisis that is the English state survived as a unitary institution, right? It's not like in France that, albeit the power of the king was recognized as larger, right, it was not counterbalanced by the one of the parliament, but there were these enormous territorial principalities like Burgundy that could create states on their own and even swallow the entire Flanders they were talking about before under their rule. But they had much more difficulty in maintaining this continuity, because also ruling a larger system is freaking more difficult. I mean, England was fairly small, compact. It was kind of easier even to govern, right? So there are lots of factors here that must be considered. But more than else, realizing the important passage that happens, let's say, between the 13th and the 14th century in medieval warfare in terms of the professionalization of the armies, right? And this very important relation, not just with money in itself, but with the political authority of reference, the one that actually pays for the army, and this model, the English model, was so effective. In fact, in the 14th century, the best mercenary company around was led by an Englishman. Guess why? Right? Because this was really an entrepreneurial model in some way, right? That had in its greatest model the kingdom itself. So that's why that's very, very, very important. So I wouldn't now venture in talking about how mercenarism is grafted into this, but I would just conclude by adding that when we talk about mercenaries here, basically there is absolutely no difference between a person that gets a salary and a mercenary. By no standard. Like this myth that there are the mercenaries that are people who just fight for money, and differently from the subjects that are so pious. Subjects suck, right? These people were constantly rebelling and they sucked. They didn't want to serve, right? Mercenaries were people that went to die for you, and it's an enormous deal, right? Because also subjects go to die for you when they're paid. Right, so this the myth of the mercenary is a son of a bitch that betrays you just because of money is a 19th century nationalistic myth that, historically speaking, has no value whatsoever. The problem here is when you say, but look at 14th century Italy, mercenaries wandering around doing this stuff. Well, aside from the fact that it was not such a disorderly business in that regard, it rather reflects the political situation in there. Right, it's not the problem of these mercenaries that were free to do what they wanted. It was the same local powers fueled that, and that's where you have to read it from. Not because those were mercenaries and therefore bloodthirsty murderers that just wanted to pillage and rape, because that's what all armies do actually. Yes, even in their own land. But it's a matter of who pays these people, how long, and with which perspective also of getting rid of them. That's what you have to look at. Not at the fact that a person is paid, because, again, there is no difference between a mercenary and a salaried person. Every salaried person is a mercenary. Every salaried person can be said, okay, but you do it for money. Well, yes, and doing it for money is a pretty good reason in general, because money can be equated to other stuff, can be useful. So it's a perfectly honest capitalistic mindset, and there is nothing wrong with that. The issues are others. The issues are political. Like, it's why you choose certain sides, why certain things happen, like why do you behave in a certain way. That's another story, right? But not the fact that you're paid for it. So, okay, we'll discuss this stuff at another time, because there is also to say, where were these people hired from, right? And as I was hinting at before, this is a moment in which warfare takes up a pretty sound European dimension. That is, by the 14th century, in an army you can find people literally from all over Europe, especially in Western Europe. It's all the same people. Germans, French, Provençals, Spanish, Italians, English. Were all the same nationalities, right? And Hungarians, right? And even more. Bohemians. But aside from that, it's important to get this gap bridged. I mean, how do we get from feudalism, ideally called so, to mercenarism, also ideally called so, right? And you realize that this end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, is of dramatic importance, and it stems from the sound development of an intensification of warfare, military practice of the 13th century. Alright, so I think we can stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.